approaches and try to find a way of addressing the drawbacks of each of these approaches. So it's arguing that there are surface level distortions which are produced through which are there in reality, and the whole sort of motivation for doing critical social science research is to unravel these surface level distortions. And so in order to fully understand any social reality, it's important to think about what these distortions are and how they can be handled. Because basically what you're saying then is that the reality you present is a distorted picture. And we need to address that. So so the main criticism of for research is that it is too focused on what are called the hard facts, and it does not take into account people's subjective feelings, emotions, and that when you're working with people, it's important to, or when you're researching human beings, it's important to address this aspect of humaneness, which is unpredictable, which is, which is full of emotion, which is full of this subjective experience, and simply treating human beings as this kind of as things does not really work. And this is CSS, or critical social sciences, critique to positivism. When we think of interpretivism, then the critique is that they're too focused on the subjective, and being too focused on the subjective means you cannot move beyond sort of individual experiences to then account for certain sort of generalized or abstract notions of social reality. So it's addressing this focus on the micro perspective, on the micro level, short term kind of settings that they think is problematic in order to get a sense of the big picture. So then critical social science becomes a way, a method, an approach to unravel social reality such that the surface illusions are dealt with, such that the surface illusions can come to light. So in both these scenarios, in both positivism as well as in interpretivism, you have a context where these surface illusions are possible, and for different reasons. One, for focusing too much on the hard facts and not taking into account subjective experiences at all. And in the other, for being too focused on micro level subjective experience, to not be able to arrive at certain general abstract theoretical ideas. But what is the sort of defining feature of critical social science? That knowledge is not for the sake of knowledge, it is for the sake of changing the world. So it's definitely oriented towards addressing those contexts which are contexts of the marginalized, those issues which are issues of the disenfranchised. So as it is, then we know that it's, we are not necessarily studying the powerful, or even if we are studying the powerful, we are studying it from the context of the powerless. Because we want through the knowledge wants to address the issue of empowerment, wants to address the issue of empowerment for change, and to address the inequalities in society. So then, Weber, did you receive the PPT?
No, ma'am. I didn't receive the PPT. I'm just waiting for it. If you could just check if it has been sent.
No, it hasn't. I'm just checking. Okay, now I think you should get it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am, got it. I'll just share.
Okay. Right. So, so this issue of then what is the purpose of critical social science? As I said in the last class, the purpose, and just now as well, that the purpose is to address issues of the marginalized in order to change society. So the view is that you want to move towards a more egalitarian and just society. And it's with that kind of view that you are using critical social science. So the purpose of critical social science is to explain social order in a way that it becomes the ground. It forms the ground for initiating change, and becomes the ground for transforming in some ways the unequal and unjust relations in society. Now, we move to discussing what the nature of, okay, so just one sort of addition to this, which means that when I say that it's about transformation of social order, it means that that the critical social scientist or the social scientist who uses critical social science research as an approach is also an activist. So it's a very politically motivated, a very political kind of approach that you're taking, which is that you are fundamentally addressing the unequal power relations in society. The example that is there in your reading is about a sort of race. We can easily think about in the Indian context, we can think about a CSS researcher studying caste discrimination. Let's say caste discrimination in the context of educational opportunities, caste discrimination in the context of, and I know that, in my previous limited experience in IIT, discrimination always end up time with discussions on it, and we can talk about that. But basically, when we think about, let's say, the example in your book is about, in the reading is about racial discrimination in the context of housing, right? So if if a critical researcher is trying to do work in this context, the researcher will then also try to mobilize groups to think about how this is impacting a certain group or a certain population, and will try and empower people to change the rules around housing, to change issues of access and so on. So similarly, if I'm looking at caste discrimination in educational institutions, as a critical social science researcher, I will attempt to mobilize students to think about these issues, to protest against certain injustices that are there in educational institutions and so on. So the goal of research is to empower. So you're not just creating knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Now, yeah, I think we can move to the next slide. Well, next and the next. Yeah, we've covered all of this. Purpose is also covered now. The nature of social reality. So what is the nature of social reality? So you will see throughout our discussion of critical social science is that there are certain elements from the other approaches that this perspective takes on. So with regard to reality, CSS will accept the premise that reality is independent of our perceptions, and that is the premise of positivism. That independent of what we as individuals think or do or perceive, reality exists. The empirical reality exists. So it believes. CSS also believes that reality exists as an empirical reality which is independent of our perceptions. And it also takes into account the fact of, from interpretivism, that we construct reality from our experiences, so that it is subjectively or intersubjectively constructed, which means that intersubjective means your subjective experience interacts with my subjective experience, and that is what makes reality. So that what I have, I think, spoken about again and again, that we engage with each other, we read each other's signals and symbols and gestures and speech, and then we interact, and that's what creates the reality. So, given that the understanding of reality for critical social science is complex, has these layers, we can say that CSS, for CSS, the reality has several layers, and we talk about 3 different layers, which is there on your slide. The real, sorry, the empirical, the real, and the actual, right? The empirical is that which is observable. So, that which is independent of your senses, that which can be treated as things. So, at that empirical level, we can say social facts as things. So it's the reality that we use our senses to apprehend, to understand. The real. Now, this surface empirical layer, that which you see, behind this is another layer, that which cannot be observed, but that which can be uncovered. So this is the deeper structure, causal mechanisms and causal mechanisms which operate behind this empirical layer. So this is the unobservable layer, but on the basis of the observable layer, you can actually get to the structures. You can actually try and understand what these structures are. So, so what we want to do when we take a critical social science perspective is that we want to be able to understand these structures and how they operate. What are the causal mechanisms? What are the things that connect to each other? Now, these structures are not permanent. So there is a kind of dynamism that we see in these structures. They can change. And obviously they can change because what your interest is in changing structures that are discriminatory, in changing structures that are unjust. So with very careful sort of investigation, researchers can actually uncover these deep structures, but it's very difficult because of the surface level distortions. So the surface level, and I had given this example of family and love in the family. So you could think of love in the family, love and care and support as a surface level distortion. And when you think of what the real structure is, there are several sort of, ideas or concepts which we can use to then think about how that observable layer is actually complicated and is actually distorting facts. Sorry, actually distorting reality. So, so the structures at deeper levels do not necessarily produce a direct and immediate appearance at the empirical surface level, and that this is the cause of the distortion. So whatever is there in the structure, what is the rule? That rule does not necessarily show up in the empirical observable. On some of the things we were talking about, where I said, okay, a rule is to be known sometimes just through its disruption, right? That you actually, unless something is disrupted, it's not easy for you to know it, know what the rules are. The other thing that I think, yeah. So what we're saying then is that at the level of the structure, these deeper things can actually lie dormant. But there are also moments in which they will become activated and emerge on the surface. So it's the job of the researcher to try and understand these moments and to give priority to these moments in terms of in terms of figuring out what the reality is. So yeah, so and the third layer then is the actual, which is you know, the causal, the kinds of things that operate at the actual level are you know, the sort of internal contradictions, the causal mechanisms, and so on. It's like, you know, the example that you have is birth and life as the opposite of death. And so you have birth and life in life itself as two parts of the same process, and they are, you know, one is opposed to the other. So each day is a day of life, but of living, but each day is also closer to the inevitability of death. Right? So this is a kind of internal contradiction that you see that operates at the level of the actual. So two things that that are opposed to each other, that contradict each other, but they are equally part of the same process. So what we try to at the level to discuss sorts of paradoxical processes. So in the context of the family, the example that I'd given is that love and power, they're opposed to each other, but they operate within they're part of the same process. And this focus on the paradoxical process is called the dialectic. And it's a central task in CS, trying to understand what these paradoxical processes or internal contradictions are, because those internal contradictions and paradoxical processes actually then will tell us about, will reveal reality to us in a very different way. So any questions at this point?
Ma'am,
It's a bit, yeah.
yes, ma'am. Actually, I'm not getting the difference between, not exactly getting the difference between real and actual realities. Like, uh, could you please
Yeah.
just explain it once?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So the difference is the empirical. Let me just go through it again. So the empirical is that which we can see, that which we can sense, use our senses to describe. Yeah. The real is that which you cannot see, but it is what drives the empirical. Because the example that I gave was, you know, if let's take the example of the family. When I see the family, I can construct a picture of the family based on what I see. But what are the norms? What are the deeper structures that are guiding relationships and behavior within the family? Yeah, those deeper structures have to be uncovered. So I will say, as a person who studies family from the perspective of, let's say, gender and how the family as a space is gendered, I will say that it's important to think about patriarchy. Right? Who is the head of the family, and why, and how does this work? So for me, patriarchy is a part of that structure, right? Something that makes apparent that structural level, but patriarchy is not evident necessarily when we observe through our senses. It's evident only when we look back and say, okay, there is this concept which I can use. So then it becomes evident, okay, why are things being done in a particular way? The actual, like I said, is that you will find internal contradictions and paradoxical processes at work. And in the context of the family, you will find the contradiction, right? You will find the contradiction between equality and hierarchy within the family, right? You're all, as children or as members of a family, there is a sense of equality. You have equal access to all the resources in the family. But we also know that that is not so. So that you will find that there are these internal contradictions. So when we think about um, when we think about the kind of, let's say, constraints that are there on the lives of young girls in the family. So constraints such as when you can go out, when you need to come back, how you need to dress, and so on. They're all in the realm of love and care, right? So the empirical, if I think about it empirically, this is what I do. It's just what is, this is what is. When I think about the real and I connect it to notions of patriarchy, notions of gender, then I know that, structural aspect to what is going on. So it's not simply about people behaving just the way they are, but people behaving because of certain structures that operate. Then when I look at trying to understand, well, what are the contradictions here? And you find that there are several internal contradictions. So it could be the contradictions between love and power. It could be the contradictions between equalities and hierarchies. It is the contradiction between birth and life. So several contradictions operate. And those contradictions then further explain both the real and the empirical. Does that answer your
Yes,
question?
ma'am.
Is that
Yes,
clearer
ma'am.
for you?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely clear. Thank you.
So any other questions? Is clear? Okay, so now what we observe then are yeah. Now, this process of discovering and understanding these paradoxes, which are part of our lives, as I said, is dialectic. And CSS thinks is of the understanding that over time, the kind of contradictions, inner contradictions that we see, which are actually irresolvable. They may contain irresolvable inner contradictions. And over time, these contradictions give rise to a revolutionary overthrow.
Ma'am, you are on mute. You are on mute.
I think somebody muted me by mistake. Yeah. So I think that this is very well understood in terms of Karl Marx's work, who is looking at the relationship in society, the relationship of conflict between the owners of means of production and the non-owners. So the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois and the proletariat. So what he says is that if you look at the history of all societies, it is a history of class struggle. So he's actually defining society in terms of the struggle between these two classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat, those who own the means of production and those who work for the means of production. So the capitalist and the working class. And what he says is that there are certain contradictions that will develop in this relationship between the capitalist and the working class. Now, if you think about capitalism as a system, is that the capitalist works to make profit. Profit is because labor has, the capitalist has figured out that if I give labor work for 8 hours, right, and it produces, let's say, X pieces of something, right, I pay the person amount Y, I can ask the worker to work for 10 hours, so it produces X plus 4, and I continue to pay the person Y. So labor has the capacity, this is the surplus that labor is producing. And the surplus basically means that you're not necessarily paying for this surplus, right? You are using labor time in a way that you don't actually have to share in the profits that you are making. So now the working relationship with the capitalist till a certain point, and he says that the means of production, now the means of production are like land, labor, capital, etc. Some of the means of production will develop. So technology will improve, more and more capital will be invested and so on. So means of production will keep on developing, will keep on growing, but the relations of production will remain the same, which means that the relations of production will remain exploitative because the system is based on this relationship of exploitation in order to then be able to make profit, and the capitalist continues to thrive. So this creates this kind of asymmetrical growth, creates a problem where means of production are growing, but relations of production are not, they remain stagnant. According to Karl Marx, this creates a conflict in the system. This creates a contradiction in the system. And because of this contradiction, when the worker realizes that there is this contradiction, it will give rise to a revolutionary overthrow, a violent overthrow of society, and a complete reimagining and restructuring of the relationship. So this is mota what Karl Marx's theory is. We will go into it in a little bit more detail as we, towards the later part of this course. Similarly, you can think of this dialectic with regard to gender, right? That you have the patriarchal structures and you have the conflict between genders, and that there is a conflict, but there is also an acceptance. So there is an acceptance of the relations of power, and this acceptance of the relations of power is what helps gender to continue not just as difference, but also as discrimination. But over a period of time, this contradiction will become apparent, and if one takes the Marxian analogy, then it could lead to a sort of overthrow of the kind of power that a particular gender has, and a reimagining of relationships. And one of reimagining, just to give you an example, is the idea of a voice that is genderless, that doesn't sort of apply any of the stereotypes around gender. So, what we want, yeah, go ahead.
Your voice is breaking like more frequently now. It was a little fine a bit earlier, but now it's becoming very like difficult to understand.
So why don't I do something? I mean, I think I've really, the last 2 days has been like this. Let me, today I will end the class, and I will put this up as a recorded lecture. And in the next class, we can begin with because I should be able to, well, I have about, let me just use the chat to write this down.
We can hear you clearly now.
But I think some of you can't, right?
In between, there was
There are 40 of you, right? Should we do the poll for this minor paper?
Yes, ma'am.
Vaibhav, is it possible for you to set it up?
Set it up.
Maybe we can
a moment.
do it on, can we do it? Let me just do the. What are we doing? Are we doing this? Any responses?
Yes, ma'am. Just give me 1 minute. I'm just setting up the poll.
You're setting it up?
Yes, ma'am. In the chat
Oh,
itself.
okay.
It up.
Okay. Okay.